Section 9 of Greece and Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World's Story, Volume 4, Greece and Rome, edited by Eva March Tappan, Section 9, How the Spartan Boys Were Trained. Footnote from Plutarch's Lives, corrected and translated by A. H. Clough, copyright USA 1876 by Little, Brown and Company. End of footnote. About the 9th century B.C. by Plutarch. Nor was it in the power of the father to dispose of the child as he thought fit. He was obliged to carry it before certain triers at a place called Lesh. These were some of the elders of the tribe to which the child belonged. Their business it was carefully to view the infant, and if they found it stout and well made, they gave order for its rearing, and allotted to it one of the 9,000 shares of land above mentioned for its maintenance. But if they found it puny and ill-shaped, ordered it to be taken to what was called the apotheti, a sort of chasm under Taygetus, as thinking it neither for the good of the child itself nor for the public interest that it should be brought up, if it did not from the very outset appear made to be healthy and vigorous. Upon the same account, the women did not bathe the newborn children with water, as is the custom in all other countries, but with wine, to prove the temper and complexion of their bodies, from a notion they had that epileptic and weakly children faint and waste away upon their being thus bathed, while on the contrary, those of a strong and vigorous habit acquire firmness and get a temper by it, like steel. There was much care and art, too, used by the nurses. They had no swaddling bands. The children grew up free and unconstrained in limb and form, and not dainty and fanciful about their food, not afraid in the dark or of being left alone, and without peevishness or ill humor or crying. Upon this account, Spartan nurses were often bought up or hired by people of other countries, and it is recorded that she who suckled Alcibiades was a Spartan, who, however, if fortunate in his nurse, was not so in his preceptor. His guardian, Pericles, as Plato tells us, chose a servant for that office called Zopyrus, no better than any common slave. Lycurgus was of another mind. He would not have masters bought out of the market for his young Spartans, nor such as should sell their pains, nor was it lawful indeed for the father himself to breed up the children after his own fancy, but as soon as they were 7 years old, they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. Of these, he who showed the most conduct and courage was made captain. They had their eyes always upon him, obeyed his orders, and underwent patiently whatsoever punishment he inflicted, so that the whole course of their education was one continued exercise of a ready and perfect obedience. The old men, too, were spectators of their performances, and often raised quarrels and disputes among them, to have a good opportunity of finding out their different characters, and of seeing which would be valiant, which a coward, when they should come to more dangerous encounters. Reading and writing they gave them, just enough to serve their turn. Their chief care was to make them good subjects, and to teach them to endure pain and conquer in battle. To this end, as they grew in years, their discipline was proportionably increased. Their heads were close clipped, they were accustomed to go barefoot, and for the most part to play naked. After they were 12 years old, they were no longer allowed to wear any undergarment. They had one coat to serve them a year. Their bodies were hard and dry. With but little acquaintance of baths and unguents, these human indulgences they were allowed only on some few particular days in the year. They lodged together in little bands upon beds made of the rushes which grew by the banks of the river Eurotas, which they were to break off with their hands without a knife. If it were winter, they mingled some thistledown with their rushes, which it was thought had the property of giving warmth. The old men, too, had an eye upon them, coming often to the grounds to hear and see them contend, either in wit or strength, with one another, and this as seriously and with as much concern as if they were their fathers, their tutors, or their magistrates; so that there scarcely was any time or place without some one present to put them in mind of their duty, and punish them if they had neglected it. Besides all this, there was always one of the best and honestest men in the city appointed to undertake the charge and governance of them. He again arranged them into their several bands, and set over each of them for their captain the most temperate and boldest of those they called Irons, who were usually 20 years old, 2 years out of the boys; and the eldest of the boys again were male Irons, as much as to say, who would shortly be men. This young man, therefore, was their captain when they fought, and their master at home, using them for the offices of his house, sending the oldest of them to fetch wood, and the weaker and less able to gather salads and herbs, and these they must either go without or steal; which they did by creeping into the gardens, or conveying themselves cunningly and closely into the eating houses. If they were taken in the fact, they were whipped without mercy for thieving so ill and awkwardly. They stole, too, all other meat they could lay their hands on, looking out and watching all opportunities when people were asleep or more careless than usual. If they were caught, they were not only punished with whipping, but hunger too, being reduced to their ordinary allowance, which was but very slender, and so contrived on purpose that they might set about to help themselves, and be forced to exercise their energy and address. This was the principal design of their hard fare. There was another not inconsiderable, that they might grow taller; for the vital spirits, not being overburdened and depressed by too great a quantity of nourishment, which necessarily discharges itself into thickness and breadth, do by their natural lightness rise; and the body, giving and yielding because it is pliant, grows in height. The same thing seems also to conduce to beauty of shape. A dry and lean habit is a better subject for nature's configuration, which the gross and overfed are too heavy to submit to properly. So seriously did the Lacedaemonian children go about their stealing, that a youth, having stolen a young fox and hid it under his coat, suffered it to tear out his very bowels with its teeth and claws, and died upon the place, rather than let it be seen. What is practiced to this very day in Lacedaemon is enough to gain credit to this story, for I myself have seen several of the youths endure whipping to death at the foot of the altar to Diana, surnamed Orthia. The Iron, or undermaster, used to stay a little with them after supper, and one of them he bade to sing a song; to another he put a question which required an advised and deliberate answer; for example, who was the best man in the city? What he thought of such an action of such a man? They used them thus early to pass a right judgment upon persons and things, and to inform themselves of the abilities or defects of their countrymen. If they had not an answer ready to the question, who was a good or who an ill reputed citizen, they were looked upon as of a dull and careless disposition, and to have little or no sense of virtue and honor. Besides this, they were to give a good reason for what they said, and in as few words, and as comprehensive as might be. He that failed of this, or answered not to the purpose, had his thumb bit by his master. Sometimes the Iron did this in the presence of the old men and magistrates, that they might see whether he punished them justly and in due measure or not. And when he did amiss, they would not reprove him before the boys, but when they were gone, he was called to an account and underwent correction if he had run far into either of the extremes of indulgence or severity. They taught them also to speak with a natural and graceful raillery, and to comprehend much matter of thought in few words. For Lycurgus, who ordered, as we saw, that a great piece of money should be but of an inconsiderable value, on the contrary, would allow no discourse to be current which did not contain in few words a great deal of useful and curious sense. Children in Sparta, by a habit of long silence, came to give just and sententious answers; for loose and incontinent talkers seldom originate many sensible words. King Agis, when some Athenian laughed at their short swords, and said that the jugglers on the stage swallowed them with ease, answered him, "We find them long enough to reach our enemies with." And as their swords were short and sharp, so, it seems to me, were their sayings. They reach the point and arrest the attention of the hearers better than any. Lycurgus himself seems to have been short and sententious, if we may trust the anecdotes of him, as appears by his answer to one who by all means would set up democracy in Lacedaemon. "Begin, friend," said he, "and set it up in your family." Another asked him why he allowed of such mean and trivial sacrifices to the gods. He replied, "That we may always have something to offer to them." Being asked what sort of martial exercises or combats he approved of, he answered, "All sorts, except that in which you stretch out your hands." Similar answers, addressed to his countrymen by letter, are ascribed to him, as being consulted how they might best oppose an invasion of their enemies. He returned this answer: "By continuing poor, and not coveting each man to be greater than his fellow." Being consulted again whether it were requisite to enclose the city with a wall, he sent them word, "The city is well fortified which hath a wall of men instead of brick." But whether these letters are counterfeit or not is not easy to determine. Of their dislike to talkativeness, the following apothegms are evidence. King Leonidas said to one who held him in discourse upon some useful matter, but not in due time and place, "Much to the purpose, sir, elsewhere." King Charilaus, the nephew of Lycurgus, being asked why his uncle had made so few laws, answered, "Men of few words require but few laws." When one blamed Hecataeus, the sophist, because that being invited to the public table he had not spoken one word all supper time, Archidamidas answered in his vindication, "He who knows how to speak knows also when." The sharp and yet not ungraceful retorts which I mentioned may be instanced as follows. Demaratus, being asked in a troublesome manner by an importunate fellow who was the best man in Lacedaemon, answered at last, "He, sir, that is the least like you." Some, in company where Agis was, much extolled the Eleans for their just and honorable management of the Olympic games. "Indeed," said Agis, "they are highly to be commended if they can do justice one day in 5 years." Theopompus answered a stranger who talked much of his affection to the Lacedaemonians, and said that his countrymen called him Philolacon, a lover of the Lacedaemonians, that it had been more for his honor if they had called him Philopolites, a lover of his own countrymen. And Plistoanax, the son of Pausanias, when an orator of Athens said the Lacedaemonians had no learning, told him, "You say true, sir; we alone of all the Greeks have learned none of your bad qualities." One asked Archidamidas what number there might be of the Spartans. He answered, "Enough, sir, to keep out wicked men." We may see their character, too, in their every jests, for they did not throw them out at random, but the very wit of them was grounded upon something or other worth thinking about. For instance, one, being asked to go hear a man who exactly counterfeited the voice of a nightingale, answered, "Sir, I've heard the nightingale itself." Another, having read the following inscription upon a tomb, "Seeking to quench a cruel tyranny, they at Selinus did in battle die," said it served them right, for instead of trying to quench the tyranny, they should have let it burn out. A lad, being offered some game cocks that would die upon the spot, said that he cared not for cocks that would die, but for such that would live and kill others. In short, their answers were so sententious and pertinent, that one said well, that intellectual much more truly than athletic exercise was the Spartan characteristic. Nor was their instruction in music and verse less carefully attended to than their habits of grace and good breeding in conversation; and their very songs had a life and spirit in them that inflamed and possessed men's minds with an enthusiasm and ardor for action. The style of them was plain and without affectation, the subject always serious and moral. Most usually it was in praise of such men as had died in defense of their country, or in derision of those that had been cowards. The former they declared happy and glorified; the life of the latter they described as most miserable and abject. There were also vaunts of what they would do, and boasts of what they had done, varying with the various ages; as, for example, they had three choirs in their solemn festivals, the first of the old men, the second of the young men, and the last of the children. The old men began thus: "We once were young and brave and strong." The young men answered them singing, "And we're so now, come on and try." The children came last and said, "But we'll be strongest by and by." Indeed, if we will take the pains to consider their compositions, some of which were still extant in our days, and the airs on the flute to which they marched when going to battle, we shall find that Terpander and Pindar had reason to say that music and valor were allied. The first says of Lacedaemon, "The spear and song in her do meet, and justice walks about her street." And Pindar, "Counsels of wise elders hear, and the young men's conquering spear, and dance, and song, and joy appear," both describing the Spartans as no less musical than warlike. In the words of one of their own poets, "With the iron stern and sharp comes the playing on the harp." For indeed, before they engaged in battle, the king first did sacrifice to the Muses, in all likelihood to put them in mind of the manner of their education, and of the judgment that would be passed upon their actions, and thereby to animate them to the performance of exploits that should deserve a record. At such times, too, the Lacedaemonians abated a little the severity of their manners in favor of their young men, suffering them to curl and adorn their hair, and to have costly arms and fine clothes, and were well pleased to see them, like proud horses, neighing and pressing to the course. And therefore, as soon as they came to be well grown, they took a great deal of care of their hair, to have it parted and trimmed, especially against a day of battle, pursuant to a saying recorded of their lawgiver, that a large head of hair added beauty to a good face, and terror to an ugly one. When they were in the field, their exercises were generally more moderate, their fare not so hard, nor so strict a hand held over them by their officers, so that they were the only people in the world to whom war gave repose. When their army was drawn up in battle array, and the enemy near, the king sacrificed a goat, commanded the soldiers to set their garlands upon their heads, and the pipers to play the tune of the hymn to Castor, and himself began the paean of advance. It was at once a magnificent and a terrible sight to see them march on to the tune of their flutes, without any disorder in their ranks, any discomposure in their minds, or change in their countenance, calmly and cheerfully moving with the music to the deadly fight. Men in this temper were not likely to be possessed with fear or any transport of fury, but with the deliberate valor of hope and assurance, as if some divinity were attending and conducting them. The king had always about his person some one who had been crowned in the Olympic games, and upon this account a Lacedaemonian is said to have refused a considerable present which was offered to him upon condition that he would not come into the lists; and when he had with much to do thrown his antagonist, some of the spectators saying to him, "And now, Sir Lacedaemonian, what are you the better for your victory?" he answered, smiling, "I shall fight next the king." After they had routed an enemy, they pursued him till they were well assured of the victory, and then they sounded a retreat, thinking it base and unworthy of a Grecian people to cut men in pieces who had given up and abandoned all resistance. This manner of dealing with their enemies did not only show magnanimity, but was politic too. For knowing that they killed only those who made resistance and gave quarter to the rest, men generally thought it their best way to consult their safety by flight. Hippias the sophist says that Lycurgus himself was a great soldier and an experienced commander. Philostephanus attributes to him the first division of the cavalry into troops of fifties in a square body; but Demetrius the Phalerian says quite the contrary, and that he made all his laws in a continued peace. And indeed the Olympic holy truce, or cessation of arms, that was procured by his means and management, inclines me to think him a kind natured man, and one that loved quietness and peace. Notwithstanding all this, Hermippus tells us that he had no hand in the ordinance, that Iphitus made it, and Lycurgus came only as a spectator, and that by mere accident too. Being there, he heard, as it were, a man's voice behind him, blaming and wondering at him that he did not encourage his countrymen to resort to the assembly, and turning about, and seeing no man, concluded that it was a voice from heaven, and upon this immediately went to Iphitus, and assisted him in ordering the ceremonies of that feast, which by his means were better established and with more repute than before. To return to the Lacedaemonians. Their discipline continued still after they were full grown men. No one was allowed to live after his own fancy, but the city was a sort of camp, in which every man had his share of provisions and business set out, and looked upon himself, not so much born to serve his own ends as the interest of his country. Therefore, if they were commanded nothing else, they went to see the boys, performed their exercises, to teach them something useful, or to learn it themselves of those who knew better. And indeed one of the greatest and highest blessings Lycurgus procured his people was the abundance of leisure, which proceeded from his forbidding to them the exercise of any mean and mechanical trade. Of the money making that depends on troublesome going about and seeing people and doing business, they had no need at all in a state where wealth obtained no honor or respect. The Helots tilled their ground for them, and paid them yearly in kind the appointed quantity, without any trouble of theirs. To this purpose there goes a story of a Lacedaemonian who, happening to be at Athens when the courts were sitting, was told of a citizen that had been fined for living an idle life, and was being escorted home in much distress of mind by his condoling friends. The Lacedaemonian was much surprised at it, and desired his friend to show him the man who was condemned for living like a free man. So much beneath them did they esteem the frivolous devotion of time and attention to the mechanical arts and to money making. It need not be said that upon the prohibition of gold and silver all lawsuits immediately ceased, for there was now neither avarice nor poverty amongst them, but equality, where every one's wants were supplied, and independence, because those wants were so small. All their time, except when they were in the field, was taken up by the choral dances and the festivals, in hunting, and in attendance on the exercise grounds and the places of public conversation. Those who were under 30 years of age were not allowed to go into the market place, but had the necessaries of their family supplied by the care of their relations and lovers. Nor was it for the credit of elderly men to be seen too often in the market place. It was esteemed more suitable for them to frequent the exercise grounds and places of conversation, where they spent their leisure rationally in conversation, not on money making and market prices, but for the most part in passing judgment on some action worth considering, extolling the good, and censuring those who were otherwise, and that in a light and sportive manner, conveying, without too much gravity, lessons of advice and improvement. Nor was Lycurgus himself unduly austere. It was he who dedicated, says Sosibius, the little statue of laughter. Mirth, introduced seasonably at their suppers and places of common entertainment, was to serve as a sort of sweetmeat to accompany their strict and hard life. To conclude, he bred up his citizens in such a way that they neither would or could live by themselves. They were to make themselves one with the public good, and clustering like bees around their commander, be by their zeal and public spirit carried all but out of themselves, and devoted wholly to their country. What their sentiments were will better appear by a few of their sayings. Pedaritus, not being admitted into the list of the 300, returned home with a joyful face, well pleased to find that there were in Sparta 300 better men than himself. And Polycratidas, being sent with some others ambassador to the lieutenants of the king of Persia, being asked by them whether they came in a private or in a public character, answered, "In a public, if we succeed; if not, in a private character." Argileonis, asking some who came from Amphipolis if her son Brasidas died courageously and as became a Spartan, on their beginning to praise him to a high degree, and saying there was not such another left in Sparta, answered, "Do not say so. Brasidas was a good and brave man, but there are in Sparta many better than he." End of Section 9. This recording is in the public domain.